So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our CAARI online lecture. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and I'll shortly be introducing our speaker, Dr. Andrew Sneddon. However, before I do so, we are joined today by a special guest, His Excellency Sam Beaver, the Australian High Commissioner to Cyprus. And I'd now like to invite Sam to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lindy, and also to CAARI for inviting me to say a few words this morning before what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating lecture on the Bronze Age site at Alambra. Well, one of the many unfortunate casualties of the global health emergency over the past year has been the opportunity for Australian archaeologists to get their hands dirty once again here in Cyprus. 2020 would, in normal circumstances, have been the 25th year in which Australian students and volunteers toiled willingly on the Paphos Theatre archaeological project led by Craig Barker. But of course, the arc of Australian involvement in unearthing the rich archaeological heritage of Cyprus stretches much farther back than this project alone. Indeed, it dates all the way back to 1937, when James Stewart led the first Australian digs on the island at Vunos on the north coast. Stewart's towering legacy continues to connect Australia and Cyprus. CAARI's building here in Nicosia bears his name, and thanks to his second wife, Eve Stewart, it also houses a selection of his archives. Stewart was the driving force in establishing Cypriot and Near Eastern archaeology at the University of Sydney, including the world-renowned Nicholson Museum collection, which is now housed in the recently opened Chowchak Wing Museum. Stewart also trained several Australian archaeologists who would focus their work on Cyprus, including Robert Merrilees, whose participation in digs at Flamudi and at Kami informed a number of his publications on the material culture of the island. Academics from La Trobe University have also made substantial contributions to Cypriot archaeology. Jenny Webb continues to research and to archive the Cyprus Museum's collection from the Lapithos digs that was suspended back in 1974. Of course, in addition to her role as director of CAARI, Linda is, appropriately for an Australian, leading an excavation of the Bronze Age beer production site at Kisonegra. And it's also interesting to remember that both Lindy and today's speaker, Andrew Sneddon, studied under Jenny Webb and David Frankel at La Trobe. Together, they and countless others have contributed to bringing to light much of Cyprus's ancient past and added to understandings of Cyprus's history and its cultural heritage. But beyond their academic value, these projects have done much to enhance Australia's reputation across the island. Whether in Alhambra, which we'll hear about today, or multiple other sites, Australians are a welcome presence in Cypriot archaeology, and their work is much admired. I certainly know that former High Commissioner from Australia, Trevor Peacock, was fascinated particularly by the site at Alambra. So on behalf of the Australian High Commission, and also the 14 resident and non-resident High Commissions who came before me, I'd like to thank the Australian archaeological community for laying, or perhaps excavating, one of the foundation stones of Australia's relationship with Cyprus. And here's hoping that we'll see Australian archaeologists back here in numbers soon, sooner rather than later, and certainly before the 10-year anniversary of the Alhambra dig in 2022. So thank you once again. I look forward to hearing from Andrew and continuing our work together with CAARI and the Cypriot authorities in this space. Thanks, Lindy.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and we look forward to the continued interest of the Australian High Commission in archaeological research on Cyprus. Now to introduce our speaker. I'm delighted to welcome all the way from Brisbane, Dr. Andrew Sneddon. Andrew has worked in Cypriot archaeology since 1995. Indeed, at the time, we excavated together at the Bronze Age settlement of Marki Alonia, directed by David Frankel and Jenny Webb, and we have been friends since. Andrew went on to undertake his PhD at La Trobe University in Melbourne on the early to middle Bronze Age cemeteries associated with Marki. This important work is published as a monograph entitled The Cemeteries at Marki, using a looted landscape to investigate prehistoric Bronze Age Cyprus. The research undertaken entailed surveying and investigating around 370 looted tombs and showed that, despite their poorly preserved state, valuable social information can still be obtained from sites of this nature. This work, along with the articles that Andrew has contributed to the field of Bronze Age Cypriot studies, can be found in the CAARI library if people wish to learn more. In addition to his research on Cyprus, Dr. Sneddon is currently a director of Extent Heritage, Australia's largest heritage consultancy. He specialises in heritage law, Indigenous heritage issues, and the management of sites on the World Heritage List. He was the excavation director of the Alambra Archaeological Mission from 2012 to 2016, the results of which will be published this year, and the site we will hear about today. I would now like to invite Andrew to present his lecture entitled New Research at the Middle Bronze Age Site of Alhambra. Thank you, Andrew.
And thank you, Lindy. It's great after all these years to be collaborating even on something as simple as this. And thank you also to Mr. Beaver for continuing a formal and diplomatic relationship between Australian archaeologists and Cypriot archaeologists that now goes back almost a century. We're incredibly proud of it here in Australia. Okay, I'm now going to share screen, so fingers crossed. Okay. Well, back in 1996, Jonathan Coleman and Jane Barlow and a number of their collaborators published the results of excavations by Cornell University at the Middle Bronze Age site of Alambra Mouttes in central Cyprus. Their publication has been a model ever since, and it was with a great deal of respect that I returned to the site 4 times between 2012 and 2016 with a number of colleagues, including Dr. Tom Reimer, Gregory Defterios, and Dr. Lisa Graham. What prompted our return was a chance find made during roadworks some 70 metres from the area that the Cornell University team had exposed. Specifically, what was found were fragments of large Middle Bronze Age storage vessels, or pithoi, as well as some fragmentary smaller vessels. The location was identified by a team from the Department of Antiquities, led by Georgios Georgiou, as a structure and some of its ceramic contents. Initially, the Department of Antiquities invited us to explore the location in more detail through limited salvage excavation, but we took the opportunity to bring with us a ground-penetrating radar and gradiometer, a roll of the dice that paid dividends. Oops. Sorry. Alhambra itself is located on the northeastern foothills of the Troodos Massif, or the Troodos Range. To Alhambra's north and east and south, it is mostly flat and mostly hot and mostly dry. In the prehistoric Bronze Age, it was one of a number of small settlements on the northern edge of the Troodos, including Marki Alonia, who we've talked about a bit already tonight, just about 7 kilometres to the west, and Politico, another 7 or 8 kilometres west of Marki. Marki was occupied for much longer than Alhambra, for the duration of the early and Middle Bronze Age, in fact. Alhambra, on the other hand, was a Middle Bronze Age settlement, overlapping with Marki's latest period of occupation for around 150 years, from around 1900 BC to 1750 BC. The proximity of the two sites to each other and this temporal overlap presented a terrific research opportunity. The physical results of the Cornell University excavation at Alhambra still sit in the landscape. There's a photo of them on the left. Stone wall footings from 7 residential structures remain exposed, and they're still visited by the occasional tourist today. In the Middle Bronze Age, they probably bore some resemblance to the early 20th century mud brick structures that still stand in the modern village of Alhambra, stone wall footings with the mud brick superstructure. But the fact that the Cornell University excavation remains so visible and nested in the landscape may have impacted the way that we conceive of the Middle Bronze Age settlement. Although John Coleman and his team always understood that the settlement must have extended much farther, it is easy today to fall into the trap of thinking that the Cornell University exposure was somehow central or even the most important part of the prehistoric settlement. We can say now that that was definitely not the case. Now, allow me to start my little slideshow, my little show and tell. My advanced slide button isn't working, so you're going to have to bear with me as I use a clunky old mouse. Firstly, to get people oriented, in this map, the Cornell University excavations are called Area A. And you can see the two peaks, Mouttes and Spilios, that dominate the area. These two peaks are sort of rounded and joined by a saddle ridge. In this image on the top left, you can the photographer is standing halfway between Area A and the peak called Mouttes, looking back towards Area B across Area A, which is visible here as a bare patch on the hillside. In the lower left photo, the photographer is standing just below Mouttes Ridge and looking to Area C, which is visible in the photograph as a flat, grassy field. You can't see Area A, Cornell's area, because it's in a ravine over that slope there. The next photograph is taken from the other direction, and the photographer now is standing on that flat, grassy area, which we called Area C, looking back to the peak of Mouttes, and you can see Area A there marked by the red arrow. There's another location that I won't spend too much time on today. It's a narrow flat terrace on the side of Mouttes hillside, circled in this photograph, and it lies between the peak and Area A. And it's always been thick with surface pottery from the Middle Bronze Age, and it's long been suspected that it was a habitation area in that period. And our ground penetrating radar and gradiometer studies confirmed that the terrace was in fact densely populated in the Middle Bronze Age. Many walls showed up in the data. Anyway, in 2012, our remit was pretty simple. Carry out salvage excavations at what we have called Area B. The construction of the road that you can see in these images was what first exposed the archaeology. And I've put a red star roughly where we started digging and where the road workers turned up some large pieces of pottery. But in this section that the bulldozer created, there was a thick, long, ashy deposit, an ashy lens, an intriguing feature that we'll return to a few times tonight. But anyway, we started our excavations where the road workers had turned up some pottery, and within half an hour of starting, we were excavating 3,750-year-old in situ pithoi, or storage vessels, capable of storing hundreds of litres of grain or liquids. And let me tell you, a bunch of people spent a lot of money to come from Australia to find something. It came as quite a relief. The road works had cut away a large had cut away most of a storage room, leaving just a little corner marked by the red arrow. Behind the corner in this photo on the left, you can see a wall that follows the newly constructed road. All that was left was this tiny corner. The main room of the house, a long, narrow rectangle, was virtually sterile of finds. Very few ceramic finds at all. There was a plaster bench and what looks like a hearth or something made out of an exhausted grinding stone, quern and the like. But generally there was nothing much in that long room. There was another part of a room here as well, but badly damaged and cut away by the bulldozer. But it was that tiny corner room that proved to be archaeologically very productive. When in use, it contained, I'm sorry, bear with me. When in use, it contained at least 6 storage vessels built into the floor and walls that made the corner of the room. These pithoi, when removed and cleaned up, were typical of the period, red polished and decorated with incisions, impressions and relief. But there were also many smaller vessels, red polished juglets, red polished bowls, white painted ware, white painted bowls, and a host of non-ceramic finds, including a bronze chisel, a bronze or copper pin, a ceramic spindle whorl, and a lot of stone artifacts, including what Franklin Webb called anvils and what used to be called mace heads, though they certainly weren't mace heads, hammer stones of some sort, a pounding stone here, more pecking stones, and this strange creature that probably would have been called a mace head once, but we really don't know what they were for. And at the foot of the pithoi, this enormous stone loom weight. All of these things in that tiny area that you saw, and all of them lying at the foot of those pithoi, and all of them buried by about 150 millimeters of ash. In fact, in the main room of the house, the carbonized roof beams of the house that had burnt down were visible on the floor. And as I said, the corner room with the storage vessels was full of ash as well. So this house had burnt down at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. In one room, we even found this jug still resting in situ in its pot emplacement. So the fact that this storage room contained so many, the metal artifacts and the like, and this in situ vessel, it sort of spoke of a hasty abandonment, possibly with cinders flying in the air as the house burnt down. But I'll return to that matter in due course. While we excavated the house in Area B, the geophysical survey was being carried out. Our focus was that flat field that we called Area C, and the geophysical survey data did show up a bunch of rectangular buildings that screamed Middle Bronze Age structures. But also this image here, the black and white one, doesn't make much sense until I tell you that those dark black spots all represent tombs. And they were located where I've put this blue star, quite close to those buildings. That's a little bit unusual because it was more typical in this period for there to be some separation between the living areas and the mortuary space. Anyway, these tombs were unknown to archaeologists, not unknown, I'm sad to say, to local looters who had really gone to town on them. Anyway, we excavated a couple of them. And as I said, the looters had done their business there, and they'd left us with not very much to find except some fragmentary vessels and occasionally small pieces of human remains. However, it is worth noting that in the tombs, the ceramics that we found in the mortuary assemblage were finer wares and more beautifully or impressively decorated than the wares that we found in the settlement, which might suggest that the people were thinking about what they were burying with their loved ones. But it was that grassy field that generations of farmers and archaeologists have walked over that proved to be the most archaeologically productive area, Area C in the map, just beneath the plough zone, sometimes only 15 centimetres beneath the point of the plough. We found the remains of several Middle Bronze Age structures. Tonight, I'll just concentrate on 2 of them. First of all, this one, we call it Trench 10. It was the remains of a 3 or 4 roomed house with an open courtyard up in the top left. And I say 3 or 4 rooms because we think there was a 4th room here. This wall extends out. So an open courtroom with 3 or 4 rooms here. Given the thickness of the walls, we think that it was almost certainly a 2-story house. In one room, a niche had been created in the corner using a line of stones with a pithos set into the ground. like the one in top left, though that was from another building. But the images on right are the photos of the pithos being excavated. That was in the corner, but the room was otherwise strangely empty. There were no pot emplacements or benches, for example, which are usually common in domestic contexts from this period. However, moving through that little hallway there would take you to the main living area. Against the wall and just inside the doorway to the courtyard's there, and you come in the doorway, and against the wall, we exposed a small and very engaging little hearth, constructed of mud brick and coated with plaster. So frustrating, I'm sorry. There we are. It's possibly anthropomorphized with two depressions and a bulge for a nose, maybe, and elaborate geometrically incised decoration of the plaster surface. But given the collection of artifacts found with it, we can say that this little spot in the house around the hearth was a very special place. Inside the cooking niche was found a damaged loom weight. Here, to the right of the picture is an illustration of a complete loom weight from Marki Alonia to give you a sense of what it would have looked like when it was undamaged and whole. But directly in front of the hearth, in this grey area indicated by the red arrow, we recovered everything that you can see on this slide. A human figure fashioned crudely from clay, a spindle whirl, two shells, both of them modified to be worn as a necklace or some form of jewellery. One of them, the hole just sort of tapped into it, the other one quite expertly drilled. A copper needle, and just behind the hearth, in a little niche created by some rocks, we found this beast here. Quite a fine specimen, worth dwelling on. A 24 centimetre tall figure of a human manufactured from sun-baked mud with a plaster surface, incised with eyes and other incisions and with ears. It's clearly a human, and I'm pretty sure this is the largest such figure from an early Middle Bronze Age context. It's the largest I've seen published anyway. The general form is recognisable from across the island in the early and Middle Bronze Age, including from Alhambra. These ones come from Alhambra, but these small pieces are much smaller, and they're red polished fired clay. Whereas our piece was, and on the left is another form that you might be familiar with. This is a plank figurine, or plank idol, as some people call them. Again, you can see the obvious similarities, but our piece was solid, not a plank, three-dimensional, and with an oval flat base that it could stand on independently, narrowing a little to the top of the head, and the ears fashioned from the clay and the plaster. So a really nice piece. Elsewhere in the room, we found some fairly typical Middle Bronze Age features. A plaster bench just inside the doorway that actually extended across to where this young lady is excavating. A threshold made of flattened stones in there, and a number of pot emplacements that I've circled in red. But the room contained one other curious feature that I have no explanation for, so I'm happy for any ideas that people wish to venture. And that is a shallow, just here, a shallow trough-like installation that is a bit too shallow to actually be a trough. It was built into the floor and faced or coated with a very hard white plaster. It sloped a little bit from top to bottom, but I have no idea what it might have been for. I'm assuming it had something to do with food preparation, perhaps for winnowing out, a final winnowing out of grain and chaff. I'm not sure, but I'd welcome any thoughts from the people listening tonight. Finally, in that fourth room, in here, we found this flat stone and the edge of what we're sure is an oven. Just to the side over here was a complete baking tray, though in very poor condition. So we think that this was where some baking happened in an annex off of the courtyard. But we believe it was unroofed because, like the other building, these two rooms were completely filled with ash, 150 millimeters of ash across the entire floor surfaces, whereas this one wasn't. There was no roof collapse due to fire, it seems. You can see in one of those rooms, there's a roof beam, or might have been the nogging of a wall, I don't know, but probably a roof beam, one there, and crossed beams there with a combination of plaster and daub. A great example of the roof collapse. But I will return to the burning later. About 8 meters from that house, we excavated a well. We got down almost 2 meters before it became too unsafe. Just to add to the lack of safety, I carefully put a metal pick at the top of the well. The fill was almost entirely empty. We did have this rather nice neck and rim of a white painted juglet. But far more interesting than the well, really, is that just next to the well, you may be able to, there is the well there, backfilled. You can see here a depression in the bedrock, less than a metre away. And it contained a large accumulation of fragmentary vessels. They were generally more complete than anything else that we found in the settlement, which sort of suggests that they were excavated more or less in situ. Now, the eagle-eyed ceramicists may have spotted the wide-mouthed jar with a vertical handle peeking out of the half-excavated deposits. In fact, in this little cluster, we had 3 of them. And these are perfect for carrying water. They resemble water-carrying vessels from other cultures and time periods. They're well suited to resting a water vessel on the water jar on your hip or your shoulder or even your head and using the handle to stabilize it. And the association with these vessels with the well is nice confirmation of what has long been suspected by ceramicists, and that is that they were principally water jars. Their association with the well is also interesting because of the Cacciati model. Some viewers today are probably familiar with the Cacciati model. Some people call it the tripartite model or the bicranial model, but it has been interpreted by some people as being a shrine in front of a well. And whether that is or is not the case, it's nice to note that the wide-mouthed jar with vertical handle, red polished, is the same as the 3 that we found in this accumulation next to the well. Another residential structure that we partly excavated before time ran out contained a few surprises as well. In an otherwise unremarkable small rectangular room, we exposed the skeletal remains of a human. To judge from its gracile morphology, it was probably a woman, but that is no sure thing. The upper part of the body extended a short way into a small niche, created at the rear of the room by the construction of a low pise wall. The skeleton was in a very poor state of preservation, but the person had been accoutred with some quite striking grave goods. Firstly, they were apparently wearing a faience bead necklace, strung in a single row, as you can see in this half-excavated image. When cleaned up, they were striking blue and really quite lovely. The faience was found here, as indicated by the red arrow. Right next to them was an earring, a copper earring, and a copper pin, just here. And strangely and uniquely, as indicated by these blue arrows, 2 copper ingots were found resting on the chest of the deceased. Now, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, this room and building had also burnt down, and the body was covered in 150 millimeters of ash. It is tempting to think that this may have been an act of domicide, that is, the person was laid to rest inside the house, their house, and then it was burnt down and destroyed as some sort of symbolic act. That is attested in other cultures in Europe and in the Middle East, but there's not really been any evidence of it in Cyprus at this time. After all of the homes that I've described so far were burnt down and only one of them had a human inside it. Rather, it more closely resembles burials, intramural burials from other Middle Bronze Age settlements, including Marki Alonia. These two were found inside the remains of abandoned buildings at Marki. Again, this is a matter I can come back to shortly. There was another unusual feature associated with the burial though. At the entrance of the room, indicated by the red arrow, right next to a door pivot, we exposed this feature. Made out of fired mud bricks and faced with a smooth, hard plaster. Its base was wider than its top, but it was not made to rest on the floor surface. The thick plaster at the base formed, this is the base of it here, formed a lip. It doesn't look like something intended to rest on a floor, but rather something that fitted over something else. Its top was concave. And it may not be obvious here, but it had a sort of bowl-like form. Now, bear with me here. This is the Vunos Bowl, familiar to many of you, I'm sure. It's a remarkable vessel that has been long interpreted by archaeologists as depicting a religious scene, played out in front of a three-pillared shrine, which you can see on the inside of the vessel, the tripartite structure, it's commonly called, with some wavy snakes there. Facing the tripartite structure is the largest figure in the composition, and he, it is clearly a he, is sitting on a chair. You can see it a little bit here, a little bit better here, and the chair is surmounted by these three strange finials, for want of a better word. I might be drawing a long bow here, but it did strike me that this feature did look a lot like the feature on the throne of the Vunos Bowl. Well, I might be wrong, but it is an unusual artifact. And in this period, furniture is depicted in other vessels with bowls and eating vessels built into them, furniture with those things built into them. So I'd love to think that this fairly prosaic feature may have been designed as a piece of furniture, possibly intended for use only once during the laying to rest of the dead person whose remains were exposed in this room. But then again, I could be wrong. Now, on the other side, this is the room here that the dead person was found in. On the other side of the wall, we exposed part of another room containing an enormous hearth, that is a horseshoe-shaped structure built against the wall and into the ground. The general form is well known from other settlements in this period on Cyprus. This is Marki again, there's a hearth there, there's a hearth there. But the size of our example was extraordinary, nearly 2 meters in diameter. And the room was clearly a little above the ordinary. We found, for example, many pieces of incised wall plaster. And it looks very much like at least part of this room had something of a psychedelic vibe going on in the Middle Bronze Age. If you can imagine a room, or perhaps the area around the hearth coated in those crazy designs. So these finds give us a lot of things to think about. So unfortunately, we need to think about them. Firstly, we might ask, when was Alhambra founded? Specifically, when was it founded relative to Marki Alonia? I noted earlier that Alambra was a Middle Bronze Age settlement, overlapping with Marki's occupation for about 150 years, from about 1900 BC. That is towards the end of Marki's occupation. But the excavators from Cornell University did find some evidence of some form of occupation at Alhambra at the early stages of the early Bronze Age. The evidence wasn't overwhelming though, and limited principally to just 4 tombs that contained EC1, EC2 pottery. That is pottery from the earlier time of the early Bronze Age. 3 of those 4 tombs were down here at a locale called Mavroyi by the locals, separated from what we think of as the settlement by the very steep ridge, the Vunos Bowl ridge. But the 4th tomb was over here at the edge of our flat field, or Area C, and it also contained 2 or 3 pieces of EC1, EC2 pottery. However, it's important to note that only 2 or 3 of those pieces in the tomb were that early. The rest were later pieces. So it's possible that the early ones that I'm talking about were heirloom pieces that found their way into a later tomb. But it is just enough to make us think that there may have been an early settlement, or founder settlement at Alambra, dating to the early parts of the early Bronze Age. So naturally, we're alert to that when we analysed our ceramics, as was Jane Barlow for Cornell University when she analysed theirs. And in fact, no clear evidence of an EC1-2 presence was identified in our excavations, and hardly anything in the Cornell excavations. In any event, there was clearly a period of about 150 years when Marki and Alambra were both occupied at the same time. And it has been suggested that Alhambra may have been founded by immigrants from Marki. So we might imagine a small group of people leaving Marki in the Middle Bronze Age, when it was becoming a little bit crowded and a bit dilapidated, and finding greener pastures and more land at Alhambra, a fairly short walk away. So if that was the case, we might expect the settlements and their ceramic assemblages to share strong similarities. In fact, in ceramic terms, the 2 settlements did share many similarities in fabric and form and technology, the ceramic assemblages, but the similarities were quite generic and common across the island. In fact, they certainly reflect a common tradition, but not necessarily do they indicate a common ceramic workshop or shared potters. Importantly, for example, there are some differences between the Marki assemblage and the Alambra assemblage. For example, at Marki, zoomorphic figurines, that is figurines depicting cattle, were really quite common. And here are some illustrated on the left. Whereas in Alhambra, in the assemblage that we excavated, we didn't have a single one. And the Cornell University excavations only had a tiny number. You're looking at most of them on the right of the screen. There were other vessel forms and wares that were present in significant numbers at Marki that were virtually absent at Alhambra. I won't bore you with the esoteric ceramic data, but for example, at Marki, there was red and black polished ware flasks, brown polished ware, black polished wares, and a variety of specific forms that we did not have examples of at all, were totally absent or very, very rare. And there's another strange, sometimes you don't know what to make of this stuff, but at Marki, the relief chain decorative motif, here's an example of one from Alhambra. It's probably the only one we excavated, but they were very common in the cemeteries at Marki. They constituted 40% of the decorative motifs from the pottery from the cemeteries at Marki, and 10% of those at the settlement, but virtually non-existent at Alhambra. So anyway, I've provided those examples to demonstrate that although the pottery from the later phases of Marki's occupation and at Alhambra share certain similarities, they're not regular or strong enough to unambiguously support an argument that Alhambra was founded by Marki immigrants. Nevertheless, it seems fairly certain that the inhabitants at Alhambra and those at Marki interacted quite often. Their sheer proximity tells us that. And there was one unexpected shared feature that the 2 sites had that might seem like nothing to most people, but to those of us who work in the Middle Bronze Age, it means something, and that is pot emplacements. This photo on the left is at Marki Alonia. As you will mostly know, I'm sure, the vessels from this period had round bottoms and round-bottomed vessels fall over if you don't rest them in a divot or depression in the floor. And so these are ubiquitous features, these pot emplacements. At Marki, they were unusual in that they were lined with a very tough plaster and stone fabric that the excavators termed pebblecrete. And they also observed that no other sites from the period used this pebblecrete. Well, the room at Alhambra with the burial in it had a pebblecrete lined pot emplacement. It's not much, but maybe it's enough to say that there's some evidence of a Marki Alonia coming to Alhambra, building a house and lining their pot emplacement with pebblecrete. Such are the flimsy foundations for grand theories, hey? Well, pot emplacements or no pot emplacements, the ceramic evidence from the recent excavations at Alhambra demonstrate that Alhambra was part of a regional sphere of interaction, just as Marki was. For example, at Alhambra, we had imports from Vunos and Lapithos on the north coast, and from Nicosia, Upper Ascavi on the central plain, and Prastio Mesorotsos, and from Denia in the northwest. There was enough imported material to demonstrate that not all of the Alhambrites in the Middle Bronze Age were stay-at-homes. Still, it has always interested me that in the prehistoric Bronze Age, on an island in the Mediterranean, never more than a fairly short walk to the coast and surrounded by fish, seafood seems not to have formed a large part of the diet. In the interior of the island, isotope analysis of the skeletal remains that we found demonstrated that the person's diet was mainly terrestrial, characterized by cereals like wheat and barley, and by fruits and legumes, and they ate animals that ate wheat and barley, so cattle and the like. So there was no evidence in the skeletal remains that we looked at to indicate the regular consumption of marine seafoods. But, as is illustrated in this slide, our excavation and Cornell University's recovered a number of seashells, commonly with holes drilled or chipped into them, presumably to make necklaces or bangles or something like that. So the sea was not entirely removed from the thinking of prehistoric Alambrans. This is the kind of bling that you still see in shops in Larnaca and Limassol, I suppose. So now, what does all this mean? We'll start with the layout of the settlement. We can be pretty sure that when the first settlers came to Alhambra, they were presented with something of a blank slate. It was what we would call today a greenfields development. Unlike at Marki, which was occupied for hundreds of years, and where the form of the settlement changed a lot, there were walls knocked down and alterations and additions put in. That's Marki, but at Alhambra, they came to an empty field or an empty flat space, and they were able to think about where they wanted to put their fields, their cemeteries, and their living quarters. And so when we look at the layout at Alhambra, I think it's a fair call to say that it reflects some kind of preferred form in the Middle Bronze Age, which you would like to think reflects some defining social relationships. The same can be said of the houses at Alhambra. They were constructed from scratch on undeveloped land, so they're likely to have been in the preferred form of house. And clearly, we can say that the preferred form of house was rectangular, but also it had a courtyard. Even the cramped houses in the Cornell University exposure, Area A, managed to squeeze in some courtyards. Anyway, by combining the results of the Cornell University excavations with our own, and with the results of our geophysical survey, and with extensive surface survey done by Cornell University in the 1970s, we are able to form a fairly good picture of the layout of Middle Bronze Age Alhambra. Rather than being a large agglomeration of homes incrementally added to, while some parts fell into disrepair and were demolished, like at Marki, Alhambra in the Middle Bronze Age appears to have comprised a number of clusters or nodes of dwellings, separated by vacant spaces and fields, and cemeteries. These red dots represent identified tombs. So the question is, why did this layout, why was it being used? Firstly, we might observe that the 7 dwellings excavated by Cornell University in Area A were in a location that was not so desirable to live in, or not as desirable as those on the broad flat field in Area C. From the outset, this hints at some kind of internal differentiation, maybe some haves and have-nots. For example, Area A was built into a ravine. You can just see it here, sloping down there and then sloping back up here. And in this photo, you can see how they've had to cut into the slope to terrace the slope to build on it. A lot of work just to get a level surface to build on. The result was a confined space and a crowd of structures. The people who lived in Area A had a constrained view. They looked from their side of the ravine into the slope of the other side of the ravine. The buildings were constructed by tried to fit everything in. Also, this slope was affected by erosion, and a number of walls had to be buttressed in prehistory to stop the erosion knocking them over. In contrast, in Area C, it was wide, open, level space. The construction of the houses in Area C required no levelling of the ground surface or any cuts or terracing or anything of that nature. And the location afforded clear views in all directions and would have enjoyed a breeze, which is largely absent from the Area A area. A boon, of course, in hot Cyprus summers. Area C had another clear advantage, and that was that nearby well. We think we found in the geophysical survey 2 more wells, so there might have been 3 wells here on this flat open space close to water. So in other words, Area C was on most measures a preferable location to build and live. There's a hint here that there may have been some social differentiation or some have or have-nots or the like at Alambra. At a more detailed level, there were also differences in the ways that the dwellings were constructed. Cornell University's Area A did not, for example, have the kinds of hearths that I've described in Area C, our cute incised one and the enormous 2-metre diameter one. In fact, in Area A, the Cornell University area, there were 6 places where the cooking fire had just been built on the bare floor surface. No hearth surrounds or permanent features. There were other small differences in construction between Area A and Area C, but the biggest difference between these 2 areas was this. Area A did not burn down. Area C and that house in Area B did burn down in the Middle Bronze Age. And this raises some questions. Was the entire settlement abandoned because a fire destroyed large parts of it, even the undamaged parts like Area A being abandoned? Or were the parts of the settlement damaged by fire? Or rather, were parts of the settlement damaged by fire and those parts abandoned, while some people clung on in Area A where the fire missed, even though it was not prime real estate? Unfortunately, we just don't have the dating resolution to answer that one. Or was the entire settlement abandoned in the same way that Marki Alonia was, peacefully and gradually, and then the deserted settlement was damaged by a fire, for example, a forest fire? But if a fire caused the abandonment of the settlement, was it an act of God or an act of war? I've wrestled with these questions for a few years now. Firstly, did the people of Alhambra flee a fire? I said earlier that the house with the storage room in it looked like it had been abandoned in haste at the time of the fire. But then the large storage vessels that were left behind are heavy and difficult to move. If you are peacefully abandoning a house with nothing but your own muscles to do it with, these vessels might be just the kind of thing that you would leave behind. They're just too heavy to move. The other room in the same house was almost devoid of pottery after all. It had been stripped. And some of those things that were left behind were not the top shelf stuff. For example, the juglet on the left has a hole in it, was damaged, and the vessel that was found in situ in its pot emplacement had also been damaged and repaired in the Middle Bronze Age. You can see the two drilled repair holes in the base of the vessel there. And although the house with the incised hearth boasted a pretty cool collection of artifacts right in front of that little hearth, the rest of the house had been completely cleared of artifacts before the fire destroyed it. And the room with the burial in it, if we ignore the fire, it just resembles similar intramural burials from abandoned houses at other places like Marki. So it's not entirely clear that the fire caused the settlement to be abandoned in haste. There are grounds for thinking that the settlement may also have been peacefully abandoned and only burnt down later, for example, in a forest fire when it was empty. I just don't know myself. I change my mind every time I give a talk. It is not impossible that the fire caused the settlements abandoned. So if that's the case, who might have started the fire? Might it have come from within? So I showed you this slide before. If you recall the layout of the settlement, it was broken into clusters of habitation, some of which appear to have their own burial areas attached to them, here, like. The social geographers tell us that this layout typically reflects a settlement with a level of tension within the community, fission rather than fusion. So might it have been intra-community rather than inter-community violence, if it was violence at all that caused the fire? It's difficult to know, but if we remember that the skeleton that I described was still wearing valuable faience, had copper jewellery and those 2 copper ingots, it does not look like a violent death. You would think a killer would strip the body of valuable things. And if the fire was an act of violence, this would fly in the face of traditional perceptions of the early and Middle Bronze Age in Cyprus. This period is actually like pieces, partners arm in arm, the woman later pregnant, then giving birth, and holding hands later with the toddler. Or these lovers and the nursing mother, baby in cradle. But there are many critics of what one scholar has called the pacification of prehistory, and I'm one of them. I don't think Cyprus at this period was all beer and skittles, but I'm just a little bit cautious about it. But for example, Bianca Casa and Kirsty Lorenz have recently demonstrated through a study of bones from Chalcolithic hands that period saw its fair share of fisticuffs. And we mustn't forget that in the early and Middle Bronze Ages in Cyprus, people were making bronze stabbing weapons in relatively large numbers. And those who weren't rich enough for that were making them out of pottery just so they could look the part. So those last few minutes encapsulate my thought processes. I swing from one argument to another on these topics. But for now, the cautious approach says we have no clear evidence of a violent attack on Middle Bronze Age Alambra, and the fire might just as easily have been due to an accident or natural causes, and quite possibly or probably after it had already been abandoned. Only more digging will clarify this crucial question. Well, thank you for your time today. As I close off, I just want to thank some colleagues who are named on this slide for their companionship as well as their help through the last few years of research. Anybody who's run an excavation knows that it can only be achieved through a team, a dedicated team and a team effort. But thank you again, and I would be delighted to answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. I have written down a full page full, but I'm not going to hold the questions right now. But while people are collecting themselves, and again, please either type your question into the chat or raise your hand and we can come to you directly to answer the question. But I'd like to just start off by saying, first up, thank you for locating us within the Alhambra landscape in that way. It was really good to see sort of the Cornell area in relation to your areas and to understand a bit more about the topography of the place, because it is quite extraordinary, really, isn't it? And I'm going to jump straight in and ask about the figurine, because when I saw the photo, I assumed it was broken at the bottom and was going to have been part of a taller thing, but it's sealed at the bottom, so it's just a head, essentially.
It's not sealed at the bottom, but it was so badly damaged, it might have been larger, but I don't think so. I think that is the base. Where are you? I think that's the base. It's too flat, too level, I think, to be a break. So I think it's just the head. I'd like to think that there was a lot more to it, and that I have the biggest figurine in Cyprus in Cypriot prehistory, but I'm a fair way off that.
Well, I think it probably still is, but and well, while you've got flashing back through slides, one of your enigmatic ground stone objects that you showed, there was a white stone one. Can you?
Yeah, it's lovely. A lot of work went into that one.
Yes.
So you can.
Three.
It's drilled at that depth at both ends.
Yeah. Oh, both ends. Okay.
Yeah.
I've got three of them that are, yeah, very fine, sort of crystalline type of white stone with just beautifully drilled holes that are only 1 centimeter deep, and the other end is flat, and we call them candlesticks because that's what they look like. And yours looks extremely similar. Yeah.
So yes, it's drilled from. I don't know if you can see my face. It's drilled that way at both ends. Yeah, but not all the way through, of course.
And the bottom end.
It is beautiful. A lot of work went into that.
Well, clearly we're going to have more of a discussion about these things, and between the two of us try and figure out what on earth they are. I'll send you pictures of my ones as well. Does anyone have any question? Here we have a question from Michelle Gamble. Thank you for that super interesting talk. Just wondering if the individual within the structure has been analysed for age and sex. I was also happy to hear about your N and C isotope results. Was it therefore possible to do C14 on the bones as well?
That is all in process. I think Bianca Casa is tuning in tonight, and she is at the Institute, and she's taken a few samples. And so the isotopes were Caterina Shire Calabra Soto. We've not done DNA yet. It's in very bad nick, but we do have plans to see what we can extract. There's a PhD student from Italy doing that, and the other tests are being done by Bianca at the Institute. So I hope to come back with a bit more soon. But it was in very bad condition. There was hardly anything that we could really use. Fingers crossed.
Yes, absolutely. I hope it works out. If people are still, here we are. We have Efthymia Alphas, extremely interesting lecture. Have recently excavated 11 tombs in the area. Yes. Katolakos. And interestingly, I think there is evidence for pot emplacements for pots used as tomb markers outside some tombs.
Wow, that would be interesting. Well, that is interesting. Well, that is, are they very large? I'm thinking if it's a little jug, it's probably not a striking tomb marker, but if you had a pithos outside a chamber tomb, that would be quite something, wouldn't it?
I think Efthymia is here without video, largish jugs. Efthymia, you could feel free to unmute yourself and comment if you would like to.
We found nothing like that at the cemeteries at Marki, where I looked at hundreds of tombs, but each settlement, there are quite distinct differences, settlement cemetery to settlement cemetery.
Okay, Efthymia has a problem with her microphone, but yeah, they were decent sized vessels outside the tombs that the department recently excavated underneath Efthymia's work. But I'm sure you guys can communicate further on that as well. Thomas Kiley here, great presentation. At some point, will you survey 19th century finds from or attributed to Alhambra? This might help clarify the EBA picture a bit. Note that Stewart, based on the CVA, attributed lots of RP wares to Phoenicias rather than Alhambra, but Onefalsch Richter's archive photographs in Berlin show some of the RP pots in the BM in photos labeled as Alhambra, including the fab ingot mold. Do you have plans to incorporate that data?
Well, I'm not flying to Sweden anytime soon, I'm afraid, but Jane Barlow and some of her ceramic colleagues did access the Alhambra pottery that had made its way to Sweden, and they agreed with that they also thought there was some EC12 stuff in there, but we've certainly found no structures that would suggest an EC12, an earlier Bronze Age presence at the place. So I don't know, if there is something going on there, it might have been on the other side of the settlement and maybe a temporary, a pastoral type or seasonal type occupation, and then the main settlement came later. But as for going into analysing all those collections, I'm afraid it's just a bit beyond me. I'm relying entirely on Jane Barlow and 2 or 3 other ceramicists who've looked at this stuff.
I think it would be nice if possible, and perhaps you tried and didn't have much luck, but especially relocating Gjerstad's house. Did you?
No, we couldn't find it, though Cornell University thinks they found it. But I didn't, but I only went over that side once. It doesn't look like it's far, but once you're down there, you've got a very steep ridge to climb up again or to walk around. So no. I remember though, back in the late 90s, I found it.
Okay,
yep.
And I've just noticed that Jenny Webb had typed in that very question about Gjerstad's house too, so I think we've answered that. Carly Henkel says quite a few interesting finds and features. Mount of Burning and the prominent halves particularly captured my attention because these conditions are ripe for the preservation of plant remains. Did you take archaeobotanical samples, especially since you mentioned that trough featured possibly being related to food preparation? And could you tell us a bit about this?
We did take soil samples. They're with Evie Margaritis at the Cyprus Institute, and she's working on that. The results haven't come out yet, but I'm hopeful. I'm also, though, a bit skeptical because the finds that I was showing you there are literally 150 millimeters below the surface, the modern surface in some places, and probably the deepest we went was 40 centimeters. It's incredible that these things survive just below the plough. So if we did find a whole bunch of carbonized Emma wheat or something, I just don't know that I would be confident enough to say that it's 1900 BC as opposed to 1900 AD. But we've got our fingers crossed. We had a few secure deposits and we'll see what comes of it. As for that trough, I have no idea what it is. I'm hoping that somebody says they've seen something in a village somewhere that can tell me what it is.
Okay, Efthemia has raised her hand. There she is. Go ahead, please, Efthemia.
Hello. Yeah, hi. Yes, well, we had the luck of Lindy actually joined me in some of the digging of the tombs. When I say pots emplacements, I'm not saying they were with mortar like you described for the site, but it was definitely an emplacement for pots, probably used as markers. In most of the cases where we were fortunate to find the area intact. And in some cases, it was very, very hard to excavate the pot. So we haven't analyzed the material. It didn't seem to me like plaster, but it was definitely very difficult to remove.
Well, that's interesting. I'd come back to the Cacciati model. If we think, we do have a tripartite structure carved into that tomb in the north somewhere there. And if you have evidence of pots being used as some kind of grave marker, then that might strengthen an argument that this is a grave scene.
Okay.
Yes, that would be
Interesting.
exciting.
I look forward to the article.
Me too. We're working on the material right now.
Jennifer Webb has another question. The vessels which you identify as water jars near the well look very like cooking pots to me, including the handle decoration. Are you sure they are not cooking pots?
There was absolutely no evidence of any heat ever being applied to them.
Did you have typologically similar ones from other areas of the settlement that did have burning though?
Yes, we had one very clear cooking pot in area B, which very similar, and I think it did have that handle decoration. And it had clear evidence of burning on the outside, heat having been applied to it. But you might want to take this up with Lisa Graham. She's quite confident that they're not cooking jars.
Okay.
Pots.
Okay, do we have any further questions? Yes, we have Paula Jones. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I just wondered if there's any way of discerning from the manner of collapse, ash deposition, intensity of heat, if the house which was burned down following the burial of the individual was intentional destruction rather than accidental.
Well, that's the big question. A lot of people wanted it to be this domicide thing where, you know, you bury somebody. There are examples of this in Bronze Age or Iron Age Croatia and places like that, where people are laid to rest in their homes and then the home is destroyed on top of them. And in describing that, I was thinking of the work that Jenny Webb has done on the bronze weapons that she has found in tombs that seem to have been deliberately destroyed before they were laid with the deceased. But I just can't see it in this example. You know, if we found 5 destroyed houses with 5 skeletons and a skeleton in each one, then it's a pattern that you can build something on. But it seems to be a one-off. There just happens to be a dead body in this burned down house. There were lots of other burned down houses that weren't. So I think it was a more general conflagration, and that happened after the settlement was abandoned. So the settlement might have been abandoned, that body laid in the room, as happened in abandoned buildings in Marki, and then the settlement burnt down. That's the best I can do. And the reason I said forest fire was because there were some nasty fires, not just in Cyprus, but in Greece as well, not so long ago. I thought, well, in the Middle Bronze Age, there would have been a lot more combustible forest around. So that's a possible explanation.
Okay, and there's a question about the faience beads with the burial and faience in the Middle Bronze Age in general. Do we believe they're locally made or imported?
I don't know. They're not that common, though. Ian Todd found hundreds in some terms in the Basilikos Valley. It was always believed that they were imported probably from Egypt, but I just don't know. And truthfully, I don't know how you can test that. Can you test that with faience? I don't think you can. Yeah.
I mean, you can analyze for tin content, and in which case they have to be imported. So they probably are imported, really. So
that was my assumption. Though we are right at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, and things are, we're about to really launch into the Late Bronze Age, so it's possible they were locally made, but I don't think so.
Walter Christ would like to know whether any gaming stones from the new excavations.
Yes, we had 2 or 3 built into the walls. Yep.
Okay. Do we have any further questions from anyone at this point? I think, well, yes, Thomas Re, the ingots, are there larger ones than these known of that particular form? I suppose he's asking.
No, I don't think so. But there might be, but I don't think so. These are pretty big. I know at Satira, they found what they were calling billets of copper, which I took to mean some kind of ingot type form, but they weren't illustrated in the report, so I wasn't quite sure. But no, I'm not sure. I think these are about as big as any that have been found.
I think perhaps at Linu as well, the recent rescue, there might have been one or two similar-ish sized ones. Okay, well, I think that's given us an awful lot to think about, and I'm certainly going to be pestering you by email with the rest of my questions.
That's all right. That's okay. We're working on the publication and hope to have the manuscript finished in the next 3 months, and then hopefully it'll hit the shelves and people can pull it to pieces.
Yeah, and with a bit of luck, maybe a live book launch at CAARI next year or something like that might be possible. That would be a lot of fun.
That would be wonderful. After all these years, I'd just be delighted.
Yeah. Well, let's thank Andrew Sneddon once again for a really fascinating lecture. And I am going to stop recording this in a moment, and then everyone is welcome to stay around and turn on your displays to say hello if you would like to. But thank you everyone for coming this afternoon, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.